Sometimes life gives you one last chance when you least expect it. At 58, Mason Clay thought his best days were behind him. Just him, his dog Buck, and the road. When Mason bought a broken-down cabin for $1 in his childhood town, locals snickered. They saw a washed-up cowboy making another poor decision. But hidden in fine print was something nobody noticed: 300 acres of forgotten ranch land. As Mason and Buck began clearing the property, they discovered more than fertile soil. Water rights, mineral deposits, and family secrets lay beneath the surface. The folks who laughed were about to learn biggest treasures are hidden in plain sight. But what Mason found, buried deepest, would change everything. Not just for him, but the town. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something special for you: the dust of Milbrook. Montana settled on Mason Clay's weathered hands as he gripped the steering wheel of his Ford pickup, a truck that had seen better decades. Through the bug-splattered windshield, he could see the main street of the town where he'd spent his first 18 years, a place he'd sworn never to return to. Yet here he was, 30 years later, with nothing but a border collie, a duffel bag, and a crumpled deed to a cabin he'd never seen. Buck lifted his grizzled muzzle from the passenger seat, his brown eyes reflecting the same weariness Mason felt in his bones. The dog's black and white coat had more gray in it now, and his movements were slower, but his loyalty remained unwavering. They'd been companions for 8 years, ever since Mason found him abandoned at a truck stop in Wyoming. Two strays finding each other, as Buck's previous owner had described them. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings on Milbrook's main street. Morrison's general store still occupied the corner lot, its red brick facade now faded to rust. The old movie theater stood empty, its marquee dark and letters missing. Betty's Diner had become something called The Grind, but the same chipped paint and crooked door suggested it was still struggling to make ends meet. Mason parked outside the real estate office, his knee protesting as he climbed out. The arthritis had been getting worse, a souvenir from his rodeo days when getting thrown by angry bulls was just part of earning a living. He'd been a decent rider once, not great, but decent enough to make rent most months. That was before the circuit changed, before the money got bigger and the riders got younger and more desperate. The bell above the door to Hartwell Real Estate chimed as he entered, and behind the desk sat a woman who looked familiar despite the extra years and gray hair. She glanced up from her paperwork, her eyes widening with recognition. Mason Clay. It wasn't a question. As I live and breathe. Hello, Carol. He removed his hat, revealing hair that had thinned considerably since high school. It'd been a while. Carol Hartwell had been Carol Brennan back then, 2 years behind him in school, and always quick with a smile. She wasn't smiling now. Her expression held the careful neutrality of someone who'd heard stories. "Heard you were coming back," she said, setting down her pen. "Can't say I expected it." Life has a way of surprising us. Mason approached her desk, noting the photographs of children and grandchildren scattered across its surface. "I believe you have some papers for me." Carol reached into a file cabinet and withdrew a manila folder. "The Elderwood cabin? Have to say, Mason, even at $1 you might be paying too much." He accepted the folder, feeling the weight of the documents inside. "That bad? Hasn't been lived in for 15 years. Roof leaks, foundations questionable, and it's about as far from civilization as you can get while still being in the county." She leaned back in her chair. "What's this really about? Last I heard you were doing well down in Texas, ranching." The word hung in the air between them. Mason had been ranching in a way, working other men's land, moving cattle, mending fences. Always temporary, always moving on when the work dried up or when staying. Too long started feeling like putting down roots. "Things change," he said simply. Carol studied him with the shrewd gaze of someone who'd been selling real estate for 30 years. "The cabin comes with 20 acres. It's rough country out there, Mason. Nothing but sagebrush and jackrabbits." Mason nodded, though something in his chest tightened. 20 acres. That wasn't what he'd been told over the phone. The advertisement had mentioned more land, but perhaps he'd misunderstood. At his age, 20 acres was more than enough for a man and his dog. Keys are in the folder, Carol continued. Map 2. You'll need four-wheel drive to get there this time of year. Road washes out pretty regular. She paused. Mason, I have to ask, are you all right? I mean, really all right. The question carried more weight than professional concern. Mason had known Carol when she was 17 and full of dreams about leaving Milbrook. Now she was asking if he was mentally competent to make decisions. I'm fine, Carol, just looking for a quiet place. Well, you'll get that. She stood and walked him to the door. If you need anything, supplies, tools, whatever, Morrison still delivers out that way. Same phone number it's been for 40 years. Outside, Buck was waiting patiently in the truck, his head hanging out the window. Mason climbed back in and sat for a moment studying the deed in the fading light. The legal language was dense and formal, but the basics were clear. For the sum of $1, he now owned a cabin and the land described in the attached survey. He drove slowly through town, noting the changes and constants. The Methodist church, where his mother had dragged him every Sunday, still stood white and proper on Elm Street. The park where he'd played baseball still had the same wooden bleachers, though they sagged more now. The house where he'd grown up was smaller than he remembered, its paint peeling and yard overgrown. At Morrison's he bought basic supplies. Canned goods, coffee, a battery-powered radio, some tools. The teenage clerk didn't know him, but Mason caught Mrs. Morrison watching from behind the meat counter, her eyes curious and perhaps a little suspicious. The drive to the cabin took him out of town on increasingly narrow roads. Pavement gave way to gravel, then to dirt tracks barely wide enough for his truck. The landscape opened into rolling hills covered in sagebrush and scattered pine. It was beautiful country, stark and honest, the kind of place where a man could think. Buck perked up as they bounced over the ruts, his nose twitching at scents carried on the evening breeze. Mason could smell sage and dust and something else. Water maybe, though he couldn't see any. The cabin sat in a hollow between two low hills, more isolated than he'd expected. It was small, maybe 800 square feet, with a steep-pitched metal roof and log walls that had weathered to silver grey. A stone chimney rose from one end, and a covered porch wrapped around the front. It looked tired but solid, the kind of building that had been built to last by people who understood this country. Mason parked and let Buck out, watching as the dog immediately began exploring the perimeter with the thoroughness of a security specialist. The air was thin at this elevation, crisp even in late spring, and so quiet that he could hear his own heartbeat. Inside, the cabin was basic but clean. Someone, probably Carol's maintenance crew, had swept it out and left the electricity on. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, with a small kitchen tucked into one corner. 2 bedrooms and a bathroom completed the layout. The furniture was gone, but built-in shelves lined the walls, and the wide plank floors were solid oak beneath layers of dust. As evening settled over the hills, Mason sat on the front porch with Buck at his side and a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant call of a hawk and the whisper of wind through sage. For the first time in months, years maybe, he felt something approaching peace. He pulled out the deed again, studying it by the light of his phone. The legal description was complicated, full of references to section lines and survey markers, but something about the acreage bothered him. 20 acres seemed too small for the distance he'd driven from the road, and the surveyor's notes mentioned boundaries that seemed to extend much further than Carol had indicated. In the morning, he decided he'd walk the property lines. Tonight, he'd simply sit and listen to the silence, grateful for whatever quirk of fate had brought him to this place. Buck stretched out beside him, content in the way that only dogs could be, and Mason allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he'd finally found somewhere to stop running. The morning sun was still climbing when Mason set out with Buck to walk what he believed were the boundaries of his 20 acres. The air carried the sharp scent of sage and the promise of heat to come, though at this elevation, Even summer mornings held a coolness that reminded a man of winter's patience. Buck ranged ahead, following scents and trails invisible to human understanding. His tail carried high with the joy of exploration. Mason moved more carefully, his knee stiff from sleeping on an air mattress that had seen better days. His eyes scanning the landscape for the survey markers that would define his small piece of Montana. What he found instead were weathered wooden posts bearing the carved initials EC, Elderwood Clay, he realized with a start. His grandfather's mark, though what it was doing on property that supposedly belonged to someone else, he couldn't fathom. The first post stood about a quarter-mile from the cabin, much further than 20 acres would extend. Mason pulled the deed from his pocket and studied the survey description again, this time more carefully. The legal language that had seemed so dense the night before began to make sense as he cross-referenced it with the landscape around him. North to the ridgeline, east to Willow Creek, south to the old cattle guard, west to the county road. Each landmark was much further from the cabin than a 20-acre plot would extend. Mason's pulse quickened as understanding crept in. Either the survey was wrong, or Carol Hartwell had given him information that was seriously incomplete. Buck barked from somewhere ahead. Not his warning bark, but the excited yip he used when he'd found something interesting. Mason followed the sound through a stand of pine trees and found his dog standing beside a creek that gurgled clear and cold over smooth stones. According to the deed, this was Willow Creek, the eastern boundary of his property. From the cabin to the creek was at least a mile. Mason sat heavily on a fallen log, the implications washing over him like cold water. If the landmarks in the deed were accurate, he didn't own 20 acres. He owned something closer to 300 acres of Montana hill country, complete with timber, grazing land, and water rights to a year-round creek. The question was, did Carol know? He spent the rest of the morning confirming his suspicions, following the boundary lines described in the deed and finding his grandfather's survey markers at every turn. Some were barely visible, worn smooth by decades of weather, but they were there, EC carved into wood and stone, marking a ranch that had apparently been sold for $1. By the time he returned to the cabin, Mason's mind was spinning with questions that needed answers. He heated a can of beans on the camp stove he'd brought and shared half with Buck, both of them eating in the kind of comfortable silence that comes from years of shared meals and mutual trust. The phone call to Carol went about as well as he'd expected. 20 acres is what I was told, she said, though her voice carried less certainty than it had the day before. That's what's in my files. Your files are wrong, Carol. I've walked the boundaries. This property extends to Willow Creek on the east and up to the ridgeline on the north. That's not 20 acres, a long pause. Mason, that can't be right. The Elderwood property has been tied up in legal issues for years. If what you're saying is true, half the ranchers in the county have been grazing cattle on land they don't have permission to use. There it was, the reason for the dollar sale. The reason no one had bothered to survey the property properly in years. Someone had wanted this land to disappear into legal limbo, to become effectively public grazing while the paperwork gathered dust in filing cabinets. Who told you it was 20 acres? Mason asked, the estate lawyer. Harold Pittman. He handled all the Elderwood affairs after the old man died. Another pause. Mason, if you're right about this, there are going to be some very unhappy people in town. After the call, Mason sat on his porch and tried to make sense of what he'd stumbled into. His grandfather's ranch sold for $1 because of legal complications that had somehow made 300 acres disappear into administrative confusion. Ranchers who'd been using the land as if it were public domain, probably for years. A town that had grown comfortable with an arrangement that benefited everyone except the actual property owner. Buck padded over and laid his head on Mason's knee, sensing the tension that had settled over his human like a storm cloud. Mason scratched behind the dog's ears, grateful for the simple comfort of unconditional companionship. What do you think, boy? Did we buy ourselves into trouble? The answer came sooner than expected. Around 3 o'clock, Mason heard the rumble of diesel engines approaching down the dirt road. He walked to the end of his driveway and watched 2 pickup trucks bouncing toward him, both loaded with men wearing the kind of hats and expressions that suggested they weren't coming for a friendly visit. The lead truck stopped 20 feet away, and 4 men climbed out. Mason recognized the type, if not the individuals. Ranchers who'd spent their lives working hard for what they had and weren't inclined to lose it without a fight. The man who approached him was tall and lean, with silver hair and eyes the color of winter sky. "You, Mason Clay?" "That's right. I'm Tom Brennan. My cattle have been grazing this section for 15 years. Understand you think you own it now, Brennan." Mason remembered the name, Carol's maiden name, which probably meant this was her brother or cousin. "In small towns, every conflict eventually came down to family. I don't think I own it," Mason said carefully. "I do own it. Got the deed right here." He pulled the document from his pocket, but Tom Brennan didn't even look at it. "Deed or no deed, my cattle need this water. Been a dry spring, and this creek is the only reliable source for 20 miles. You can't just show up and fence us out." "I haven't fenced anybody out. Haven't even walked the whole property yet. But you're planning to." This from one of the other men, younger and clearly angrier than Brennan. "City boy comes back home, figures he'll play rancher." Mason felt heat rise in his chest. Not anger exactly, but something older and more dangerous. "I haven't been a city boy for 40 years, son. Been working cattle since before you were born. Then you know what it means to cut a man off from water." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. In ranch country, water rights were serious business. Men had been shot over less. Tom Brennan stepped forward, his voice carefully controlled. "Look, Clay, I'm sure we can work something out. Maybe a lease arrangement or shared access. But my cattle have been drinking from Willow Creek since my daddy's time. I can't just move them." Mason studied the 4 men, noting the set of their shoulders, the way they'd positioned themselves. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to intimidate. "I'm not looking to hurt anybody's operation," he said finally. "But I'm not signing away my rights on day 2 of ownership either. Give me some time to figure out what I've got here." "How much time?" "As much as I need." Tom Brennan's jaw tightened. "That's not good enough. My cattle need water now, not when you get around to figuring things out. Then I guess you better hope your cattle are good swimmers, because they're going to keep drinking from Willow Creek, whether I give them permission or not." It wasn't the smartest thing Mason had ever said, but it was honest. He wasn't about to be bullied into giving up property rights before he even understood what those rights included. The men exchanged glances, and Mason sensed the moment when neighborly concern shifted into something harder. "This isn't over," Tom Brennan said, climbing back into his truck. "Not by a long shot." As the trucks drove away in clouds of dust, Mason stood in his driveway with Buck beside him and tried to convince himself that he hadn't just made enemies of half the county. The truth was, he probably had. The question now was whether one aging cowboy and his dog were tough enough to stand up to the consequences. That night, Mason sat at the small kitchen table with his laptop, one of the few concessions he'd made to modern times, and tried to piece together the legal maze surrounding his property. The internet connection was spotty this far from town, but patient persistence eventually yielded results. The Elderwood Ranch had once been a substantial operation, nearly 1,000 acres stretching from the county road to the national forest boundary. Established in 1892 by his great-grandfather, it had been passed down through 3 generations of Elderwood men until it came to Silas Elderwood in 978. Silas had no children, and apparently no close relatives except for a sister who had married a Clay and moved to Texas. Mason's grandmother, it turned out. Though he'd never known her well, the property records became muddled after Silas's death in 2009. Various legal documents referenced mineral rights, water rights, grazing leases, and boundary disputes. The more Mason read, the more he understood why Carol had been confused about the acreage. Someone had worked very hard to make the Elderwood Ranch disappear into bureaucratic quicksand. Buck lifted his head from where he'd been dozing by the fireplace. His ears pricked. A moment later, Mason heard what the dog had sensed, the crunch of gravel under tires. He glanced at his watch. Nearly 10 o'clock, too late for a social call. Through the window, he saw headlights approaching slowly, more cautiously than Tom Brennan's aggressive arrival that afternoon. This was someone who didn't want to spook him, which in Mason's experience could be either very good or very bad. The vehicle stopped well short of the cabin, and Mason heard a car door close gently. A figure approached through the darkness, a woman moving with the careful steps of someone navigating unfamiliar ground by moonlight. Mr. Clay. The voice was younger than he'd expected, with an educated accent that didn't quite fit with ranch country. "I'm sorry to bother you so late. I'm Jennifer Walsh, from the county assessor's office." Mason opened the door but kept the screen latched. "Kind of late for county business. I know, and I apologize. But I thought you should see this before anyone else gets wind of it." She held up a manila folder. "I've been going through old survey records and I found something that might interest you." Buck moved to Mason's side, not growling but clearly alert. The dog's judgment of people had always been reliable, and his calm but watchful posture suggested caution without immediate alarm. What kind of something? Jennifer Walsh stepped into the porchlight, revealing a woman in her 30s with dark hair pulled back and eyes that held the particular intensity of someone who spent her days working with numbers and legal documents. She wore jeans and a wool coat that had seen better days, practical clothes that suggested she understood this country even if she hadn't grown up in it. "May I come in?" "This is going to take some explaining." Mason considered his options. The smart thing would be to tell her to come back during normal business hours. But something in her manner suggested urgency. And after the confrontation with Tom Brennan, he was hungry for information that might help him understand what he'd gotten himself into. He unlatched the screen door. Inside, Jennifer Walsh declined his offer of coffee and spread documents across his kitchen table. "I've been with the county for 3 years," she said, "and I've never seen anything quite like this. When Carol Hartwell called about the acreage discrepancy, I started digging into the Elderwood files." She pulled out a map that looked much older than the deed Mason had been given. "This is the original survey from 1982, the last time anyone did a complete boundary assessment. According to this, the Elderwood Ranch consisted of 947 acres. Not the 20 acres in your paperwork." Mason studied the map, noting how the boundaries extended much further than he'd walked that morning. "So what happened to the other 647 acres? That's where it gets interesting." Jennifer pulled out another document, this one thick with legal seals and official stamps. In 1995, Silas Elderwood signed a complex agreement with something called the Milbrook Development Corporation. On paper, it looks like a partial sale. 647 acres sold to the corporation for development purposes. On paper, the Development Corporation never existed as anything more than a legal entity. No assets, no employees, no actual development. Just a name on documents. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "But here's the thing. The sale was contingent on certain conditions being met within 10 years. Environmental impact studies, zoning changes, infrastructure development. None of that ever happened." Mason felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he'd get just before a bull exploded out of the chute. Which means that according to the terms of the original agreement, if the development conditions weren't met by 2005, the land would revert to the Elderwood estate. Jennifer smiled, though it was a grim expression. "Mr. Clay, I think you own a lot more than 300 acres. I think you might own the entire original ranch." The implications hit him like a physical blow. Nearly 1,000 acres of Montana hill country, complete with mineral rights, timber rights, and enough water to supply half the county. No wonder Tom Brennan had been upset about cattle access. "Who knows about this?" he asked. "As of right now? You, me, and whoever set up that Development Corporation shell game 15 years ago." Jennifer began gathering her papers. "But it won't stay quiet long. Property records are public documents, and once word gets out that the Elderwood Ranch is back in private hands. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Mason could imagine the reaction from ranchers who'd been treating nearly 1,000 acres as free range for over a decade. The confrontation that afternoon would look like a friendly disagreement by comparison. Why are you telling me this? Why not just file your report through normal channels? Jennifer Walsh paused in her packing, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she looked uncertain. Because I think someone's been deliberately keeping this information buried. The Development Corporation paperwork should have triggered automatic reviews when the conditions weren't met. Instead, it got filed away and forgotten. That doesn't happen by accident. You think someone in the county government is involved. I think someone with access to county records has been making sure the Elderwood Ranch stayed in legal limbo. She stood and shouldered her bag. Be careful, Mr. Clay. You've stumbled into something that someone went to a lot of trouble to hide. After she left, Mason sat at his table staring at the documents she'd left copies of. Buck padded over and rested his chin on Mason's knee, offering the simple comfort of presence. What do you think, boy? Are we in over our heads? Buck's tail thumped once against the floor, not exactly an answer, but definitely an expression of confidence in whatever decision Mason might make. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain. Mason walked onto the porch and looked out over land that might stretch much further into the darkness than he'd imagined. Somewhere out there, cattle were grazing on grass that legally belonged to him. Somewhere out there, water flowed through creeks that he apparently owned the rights to. And somewhere out there, people who had grown comfortable with the current arrangement were probably not going to appreciate the change. Mason had spent most of his adult life moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots or make enemies. Now at 58, he found himself the owner of nearly 1,000 acres and the probable enemy of half the county. The smart thing would be to sell it all and move on. Find another truck stop, another temporary job, another road to somewhere else. But as he stood on the porch, listening to the wind and feeling the solid weight of his grandfather's land beneath his feet, Mason realized he was tired of running. Maybe it was time to make a stand, even if he wasn't entirely sure what he was standing for. Dawn came early to the high country, and Mason woke to find Buck standing at the window, his body tense with alertness. Outside, nothing moved except the sage-grass bending in the morning breeze. But the dog's instincts were rarely wrong about intruders. Mason dressed quietly and stepped onto the porch, his eyes scanning the landscape for whatever had caught Buck's attention. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the rolling hills and scattered pine that had become familiar over the past few days. Then the sun caught something that didn't belong, fresh tire tracks in the dirt near the creek, too far from any road for casual visitors. He walked to the tracks with Buck ranging ahead, the dog's nose working overtime on scents Mason couldn't detect. The tracks were wide and deep, made by a heavy truck or machinery. They led from the creek bed toward the timberline, following what looked like an old logging road that hadn't been used in years. Mason followed the tracks for half a mile before Buck suddenly stopped and began digging at the base of a large pine. The dog's behavior was purposeful, not playful, and within minutes he'd uncovered something that made Mason's pulse quicken: the corner of a wooden crate, weathered but intact. It took 20 minutes to fully excavate the crate, and when Mason pried off the lid, he found carefully wrapped surveying instruments from another era. A compass, measuring chains at transit level, and underneath it all, a leather-bound notebook filled with his grandfather's handwriting. The notebook was a revelation. Page after page of survey notes, mineral assessments, and water flow measurements dating from the 1960s through the early 1980s. Silas Elderwood had been methodical in his documentation, recording everything from seasonal creek levels to the location of what he described as significant mineral deposits along the eastern ridge. One entry, dated September 1979, caught Mason's attention. Confirmed copper vein extends at least 200 yards northeast from marker EC7. Assay shows 2.3% copper content, possibly viable for small-scale extraction. Note, keep findings confidential until water rights secured. Mason sat back on his heels, the notebook open in his lap. His grandfather had discovered mineral deposits valuable enough to worry about keeping them secret. And someone had been on his land the night before, following the old logging roads toward those same eastern ridges. Buck's low growl brought him back to the present. The dog was looking toward the timberline, his hackles raised. Mason followed his gaze and caught a flash of movement, someone watching from the tree line. Too far away to identify, but close enough to have been observing him for some time, the figure disappeared as soon as Mason spotted them, melting into the forest with the skill of someone who knew the country well. Mason waited several minutes, but whoever it was didn't reappear. Back at the cabin, Mason spread his grandfather's survey notes on the kitchen table and began comparing them to the modern maps Jennifer Walsh had provided. The correlation was exact. Every mineral deposit, every water source, every valuable resource Silas had documented fell within the boundaries of the property Mason now owned. The phone rang just after noon. Carol from the real estate office, her voice tight with stress. "Mason, we need to talk. Can you come into town?" "Oh, what's this about?" "Not over the phone. Just come in, please. It's important." The drive to Milbrook gave Mason time to think, though his thoughts kept circling back to the same uncomfortable conclusion. He'd stumbled into something much larger than a simple property dispute. The mysteriously buried legal documents, the shell corporation that had tried to claim most of his land. The fresh tire tracks and hidden observer, none of it felt like coincidence. Carol's office was crowded when he arrived. Along with Carol herself, he found Jennifer Walsh, a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Harold Pittman, and Tom Brennan looking significantly less friendly than he had during their first encounter. "Mason," Carol began, "Mr. Pittman has some concerns about the validity of your deed." Harold Pittman was a small man, with the soft look of someone who'd spent his career behind a desk, but his eyes held the sharp intelligence of a practiced legal mind. He opened a briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. "Mr. Clay, I'm afraid there may be some irregularities in your property transfer. The estate I represented, Silas Elderwood's estate, included significant restrictions on any sale of the ranch property. I'm not certain those restrictions were properly addressed in your transaction." Mason accepted the documents Pittman handed him, though the legal language was dense enough to require careful study. "What kind of restrictions?" "Environmental assessments, mineral rights evaluations, water impact studies. The kind of due diligence required for any large property transfer in this county." Pittman's smile was professionally apologetic. "I'm sure it's just a paperwork issue, but until it's resolved, you may want to avoid making any major decisions about land use." Jennifer Walsh leaned forward. "Mr. Pittman, I've reviewed the estate files. There's no record of any environmental restrictions being placed on the property." "Then your review was incomplete, Ms. Walsh. I have the original documentation right here." The documents Pittman produced looked official, complete with seals and notarized signatures. But Mason noticed that the dates on some of the paperwork seemed inconsistent, and the signatures didn't quite match each other in style or ink color. "How long have you been sitting on these documents?" Mason asked. "I beg your pardon?" "Simple question. If these restrictions existed when Silas died in 2009, why are you bringing them up now, in 2024? Pittman's professional composure slipped slightly. "The estate was complex, Mr. Clay. Not all issues could be resolved immediately. Tom Brennan had been silent through the exchange, but now he spoke up. Seems to me the simplest solution is for Clay here to recognize that this land has been in use by the community for 15 years. No need to upset arrangements that work for everybody." Mason stood, the document still in his hand. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your concern for my legal situation. But until someone shows me a court order that says otherwise, I'm going to assume I own what my deed says I own." Outside, Jennifer Walsh caught up with him in the parking lot. "Mr. Clay, those documents were forged." The paper stock is wrong, the seals don't match county records, and the notary stamps aren't even close to authentic. You sure about that? I work with these documents every day. Someone put together a rush job, probably last night after our conversation. Mason looked back toward the real estate office, where he could see Tom Brennan and Harold Pittman engaged in what appeared to be an intense discussion. Any idea who might have that kind of access to official forms and seals? Jennifer was quiet for a moment. It would have to be someone with connections to the county clerk's office, or the assessor's office, or maybe even the sheriff's department. She paused. Mr. Clay, I think you should know. My supervisor called me in early this morning, told me to stop researching the Elderwood property, said it was outside my normal duties, and I've been with the county for 3 years. I've never been told to stop researching anything before. As Mason drove back to the cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being maneuvered into a corner. The forged documents, the pressure to accept the status quo, the convenient appearance of legal restrictions that had been hidden for 15 years. It all pointed to a coordinated effort to separate him from his property. The question was, who was coordinating it, and how far were they willing to go? Buck was waiting for him on the porch, tail wagging but eyes alert. As Mason climbed the steps, the dog moved to his side in the protective stance that meant he'd sensed trouble. "Yeah, boy," Mason said, scratching behind Buck's ears. "I think we're going to need to watch our backs for a while." The next morning brought clouds heavy with the promise of rain, and Mason decided it was time to explore the eastern ridge, where his grandfather's notes had mentioned mineral deposits. Buck seemed eager for the adventure, ranging ahead with renewed energy as they climbed through stands of lodgepole pine and scattered aspen. The terrain grew rockier as they ascended, and Mason found himself thinking about the grandfather he'd barely known. Silas Elderwood had been a distant figure during Mason's childhood, a stern man who disapproved of his daughter's marriage to a Clay and had little patience for visiting grandchildren. Now, reading through the old survey notes, Mason was beginning to understand that Silas had been protecting something valuable, something worth keeping secret from the world. Buck's excited barking drew Mason's attention to an outcropping of stone that didn't match the surrounding geology. The rock face showed clear signs of having been worked: drill holes, tool marks, and a partially excavated shaft that disappeared into the hillside. Mason pulled a flashlight from his pack and peered into the opening. The tunnel extended about 30 feet into the rock before opening into a small chamber. The air inside was cool and dry, and Mason's light revealed something that made his breath catch. Veins of green-tinged copper ore running through the rock walls like metallic lightning. His grandfather hadn't just found traces of copper, he'd found a substantial deposit on the floor of the chamber, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into a natural shelf. Mason discovered another cache of his grandfather's records. These documents were more detailed than the survey notes, including assay reports from a mining engineer in Billings and correspondence with copper buyers as far away as Denver. One letter, dated March 1981, was particularly revealing. "Dear Mr. Elderwood, based on your samples and our preliminary assessment, we believe the deposit could yield 50 to 75 tons of recoverable copper over a 5-year extraction period. At current market prices, this represents a gross value of approximately $2.3 million. We would be very interested in discussing exclusive purchasing agreements." Mason sat back on his heels, the letter trembling in his hands. $2.3 million in 1981 currency. Adjusted for inflation, the copper deposit alone was worth several times that amount today. Add in timber rights, water rights, and grazing fees, and he was looking at property worth tens of millions of dollars. No wonder someone wanted it badly enough to forge legal documents. The sound of engines echoing off the hills brought him back to the present. Buck appeared at the tunnel entrance, his posture alert and protective. Mason quickly rewrapped the documents and tucked them inside his jacket before emerging into daylight. 3 ATVs were making their way up the ridge, following trails that Mason hadn't noticed on his way up. The riders wore hunting gear and moved with the purposeful efficiency of people who knew exactly where they were going. As they drew closer, Mason recognized Tom Brennan on the lead machine. But the other two men were strangers. The ATVs stopped 50 yards away, close enough for conversation, but far enough to maintain tactical advantage. Tom Brennan dismounted and approached on foot, his companions remaining mounted and ready. "Afternoon, Clay. Thought we might find you up here." "It's my land," Mason said simply. "I can go where I please on it." "See, that's where we have a difference of opinion." Brennan gestured toward the mine entrance. "This particular section has been off-limits for 15 years. Environmental concerns, you understand. Wouldn't want anyone getting hurt poking around old mining claims." Mason noted the careful phrasing. "Not abandoned mines or historical sites, mining claims, suggesting current or ongoing interest. Whose claims would those be?" "The Milbrook Development Corporation holds the mineral rights to this section. Since 1995. Brennan's smile was cold. "Of course, you being new to property ownership, you might not understand how these things work. I understand that mineral rights transfer with property ownership unless specifically reserved in writing." Mason pulled out his deed. "See any mineral reservations listed here?" One of the mounted men shifted restlessly, his hand moving toward something that might have been a sidearm. Buck moved closer to Mason, his hackles beginning to rise. "Legal documents can be complicated," Brennan said. "Sometimes what looks simple on paper gets more complex when lawyers start examining the fine print." "Is that a threat?" "It's friendly advice from someone who's been ranching this country for 40 years. Sometimes the smart play is to take what's offered and walk away happy." Mason looked at the three men, noting their positions, their equipment, their obvious familiarity with the terrain. They'd come prepared for confrontation, but they were still trying to resolve things through intimidation rather than violence. That suggested limits to how far they were willing to go, at least for now. "What exactly is being offered?" "Fair market value for 20 acres and the cabin. Enough to set you up someplace more suitable for a man your age." The condescension in Brennan's voice was carefully calculated to provoke a reaction. Mason felt his temper rise but kept his voice level. "And if I'm not interested in selling, then you might find ranch life more challenging than you expected. Accidents happen out here. Equipment breaks down. Sometimes help is a long way off when you need it." The threat was clear enough, though phrased carefully to maintain plausible deniability. Mason had heard similar warnings in his younger days, usually from men who'd never had to back up their intimidation with actual violence. "I appreciate the concern," Mason said, "but I think I'll take my chances." Brennan's expression hardened. "Your choice, but don't say nobody tried to warn you." The three men remounted their ATVs and disappeared down the hillside, leaving Mason alone with Buck and the echoing rumble of engines. The dog remained tense until the sound faded completely, then relaxed with a heavy sigh that seemed to express his opinion of the entire encounter. That evening, Mason sat on his porch reading through his grandfather's mining correspondence by lamplight. The picture that emerged was of a man who discovered something valuable, but had been careful to keep it secret. Several letters referenced the need for discretion, and one from the mining engineer specifically warned against premature disclosure to local interests who might attempt to force unfavorable terms. Apparently, Silas had learned the hard way that in small communities, valuable discoveries had a way of becoming community property, unless the owner was prepared to fight for exclusive rights. A phone call from Jennifer Walsh interrupted his reading. "Mr. Clay, I wanted to let you know I was formally reassigned today. Told my new duties don't include property research." "I'm sorry to hear that. The thing is, before they locked me out of the system, I managed to do some more digging into the Milbrook Development Corporation. Want to guess who the original investors were?" Mason felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "Tell me." "Harold Pittman, Tom Brennan, and 3 other local ranchers, including the current mayor and the county commissioner who oversees mineral rights." She paused. "Mr. Clay, you're not just fighting individual ranchers. You're fighting a coordinated group that includes some of the most powerful people in the county. After the call, Mason walked to the edge of his property and looked out over the darkening landscape. Somewhere out there, cattle grazed on his grass, water flowed through his creeks, and valuable minerals lay buried in his hills. And somewhere out there, powerful men were making plans to ensure he never got the chance to claim what was legally his. But as he stood listening to the night sounds of his inherited land, the creek running over stone, the wind through pine, the distant call of a nighthawk, Mason felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the deep satisfaction of belonging somewhere worth defending. Buck appeared at his side, as if sensing the moment's significance. Together, they stood watch over the ranch that was finally home. Mason spent the next 2 days fortifying his position, both literally and legally. He drove to Helena and hired an attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in property law and mineral rights. Her initial assessment was both encouraging and sobering. "Your deed appears solid," she said, reviewing the documents in her downtown office. "But you're right to be concerned about the organized opposition. When local power brokers coordinate against a property owner, they usually have resources and connections that individual landowners can't match." She recommended filing for quiet title action to establish his ownership beyond legal challenge, but warned that the process could take months and would certainly provoke escalation from his opponents. "Are you prepared for that level of conflict, Mr. Clay? Because once we file these papers, there's no backing down quietly." Mason thought about the mining chamber, the forged documents, and Tom Brennan's thinly veiled threats. "I think they've already made that decision for me." Back at the ranch, Mason began implementing practical security measures. He installed trail cameras at strategic points around the property, set up motion-activated lights near the cabin, and established emergency communication protocols with Sarah Chen's office. Buck seemed to approve of these preparations, patrolling the perimeter each morning and evening with increased vigilance. On the 4th night after his trip to Helena, the harassment began in earnest. Mason woke to Buck's urgent barking and the sound of cattle lowing in distress. Outside, he found his property overrun with approximately 50 head of cattle, all bearing the Brennan brand. The animals had been driven onto his land and were now trampling his gardens, fouling his water sources, and generally making the place uninhabitable. The message was clear. If he wanted to play property owner, he'd have to deal with all the complications that came with neighboring ranches. Mason spent the pre-dawn hours documenting the invasion with photographs and video, then called the sheriff's department. The deputy who eventually responded, a young man who seemed genuinely apologetic, explained that cattle trespass was a civil matter unless Mason could prove intentional damage. "You could file a complaint," the deputy offered, "but most ranchers around here work these things out between themselves, and if they don't want to work it out." The deputy's shrug said everything about how much help Mason could expect from official channels. By noon, Tom Brennan arrived to collect his cattle, bringing with him a crew of riders who made a show of taking their time about the roundup. The process took 4 hours and left Mason's property looking like a battlefield. "Sorry about the mix-up," Brennan said, his tone suggesting anything but apology. "Cattle sometimes wander when fences are down. Of course, good neighbors usually help each other maintain fence lines. The implication was obvious: cooperate with their arrangement, or expect more accidents." That evening, Mason called Jennifer Walsh from his secure satellite phone. She'd been monitoring the situation from her new position in the county clerk's office and had disturbing news. "They're moving fast," she reported. "Filed 3 separate mineral rights claims this week, all covering sections of your property. Also submitted environmental impact assessments claiming the area needs protection from unauthorized mining activity." Can they do that? "File claims on land I own?" "Not legally, but the claims create bureaucratic obstacles. Even when you prove them invalid, the process takes time and money. Meanwhile, they're establishing a paper trail that makes their eventual ownership look legitimate." Mason walked to his grandfather's hidden mining records and spread them across his kitchen table. Somewhere in Silas's careful documentation might be the evidence he needed to fight back. He found it in a folder marked Water Rights 1962-1983. Detailed measurements of creek flow, spring locations, and seasonal variations that established his property as the source of water for 3 separate creek systems. According to Silas's calculations, cutting off water access to the eastern ridge would affect grazing capacity on nearly 10,000 acres of surrounding ranch land. More importantly, one document showed that in 1978, Silas had filed formal water rights claims with the state, predating any of the current ranch's access agreements by decades. The filings had never been challenged, which meant they were probably still valid. Mason had found his leverage. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Buck announced the arrival with curious whines rather than alarm barks, suggesting someone the dog found interesting rather than threatening. Mason found an elderly Native American man sitting calmly on his porch steps, apparently content to wait as long as necessary. "You must be Clay's grandson," the man said, rising slowly to his feet. "I'm Joe Crowfeather. Knew your grandfather pretty well in the old days." Joe was probably 75, with weathered hands and eyes that held the particular alertness of someone who'd spent his life reading landscape and weather. He wore work clothes that had seen decades of use, but were clean and well-maintained. Silas mentioned me in his papers. Not by name, but he wrote about learning traditional mining techniques from local experts. Joe smiled. "That was me and my brother. We showed him how to read rock formations, how to test for minerals without fancy equipment. Over coffee, Joe shared stories about Silas that painted a picture of Mason's grandfather as a more complex man than family legend suggested. Far from the stern, humorless rancher Mason remembered, Silas had apparently been curious about everything: geology, hydrology, native history, and the complex relationships between land use and long-term sustainability. "Your grandfather was worried about something toward the end," Joe said. "Kept talking about people who wanted to take the land away from his family. Said he'd hidden things that would help you fight back when the time came." "What kind of things?" Joe's eyes grew distant. Silas was a careful man. Careful about records, careful about legal documents, careful about making sure the right information would be available to the right person at the right time. He looked directly at Mason. "You found his mining records." "Some of them." "That's not all he hid." Joe stood and walked to the edge of the porch. "Your grandfather knew this land better than any white man I ever met. Knew where every spring started, where every mineral vein ran, where every old trail went." He pointed toward the timberline. "He also knew that someday people would try to steal it. So he made sure his grandson would have everything needed to fight back." "Where?" Joe Crowfeather smiled and began walking toward the forest. "Come on. Time you learned what your inheritance really includes." Buck fell in beside the old man, as if they'd been companions for years, and Mason followed them both into the timber, wondering what other secrets his grandfather had hidden in these hills. Behind them, the cabin sat silent in the afternoon sun, while high overhead, the trail cameras Mason had installed recorded the approach of vehicles that moved with the careful stealth of people who didn't want to be seen. Joe Crowfeather led Mason, and Buck through stands of lodgepole, pine to a section of forest that looked unremarkable until Joe knelt beside what appeared to be a natural rock formation. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, revealing that the rocks were actually a carefully camouflaged entrance to a root cellar built into the hillside. "Your grandfather was paranoid about keeping records safe," Joe said, pulling a key from around his neck. "Turns out he had good reason to be. The cellar was larger than Mason expected, carved into solid rock and lined with metal shelving. Waterproof containers filled every available space, each labeled with dates and contents in Silas's methodical handwriting. But it was the table in the center of the space that caught Mason's attention, covered with maps, legal documents, and photographs that painted a picture far more complex than anything he'd imagined. "Jesus," Mason breathed, looking at aerial photographs that showed the entire valley floor. Red lines marked property boundaries, but not the ones he'd seen on official county maps. These boundaries showed a different reality entirely. Joe opened one of the containers and pulled out a thick folder. Your grandfather spent the last 15 years of his life documenting what he called the Great Land Grab. Want to know what you really inherited? The documents Joe showed him were explosive. Detailed records of property transfers, shell corporations, forged documents, and intimidation tactics that went back decades. The Milbrook Development Corporation wasn't just trying to steal Mason's land. They'd been systematically acquiring property throughout the county through fraud, manipulation of legal records, and outright theft. Silas figured it out in the 1990s. Joe explained, spreading maps across the table. Started tracking property transfers, mining claims, water rights purchases. What he found was a coordinated effort to consolidate ownership of mineral rights across about 50,000 acres of prime Montana land. Mason studied the maps, his anger building as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. How many people did they steal from? At least 30 families. Small ranchers mostly, people who didn't have resources to fight expensive legal battles. The pattern was always the same: create legal complications, make ownership expensive and difficult, then swoop in with shell corporations offering to buy out the problems. One map showed the true extent of Mason's property, not the 947 acres he'd thought he inherited, but over 1,200 acres assembled through fraudulent acquisition of adjacent parcels. His grandfather hadn't just been protecting the family ranch. He'd been building a legal fortress to fight back against organized theft. But why sell to me for $1? Why not just fight them directly? Joe's eyes glittered with something that might have been admiration. Because Silas was smarter than they were. He knew that as long as he owned the land, he was just one old man they could intimidate or outlast. But if he could get someone younger involved, someone with military experience and a reason to fight. I never served in the military. No, but your father did. Marine Corps, 2 tours in Vietnam. Silas kept track of family, even when family didn't keep track of him. Joe pulled out another folder, this one containing detailed background information on Mason himself. He knew you'd been working ranches, knew you understood the business. More importantly, he knew you'd inherited your father's stubborn streak. Mason felt a chill as he realized the implications. He set me up. The whole thing was a trap, not a trap, a weapon. Look at this. Joe showed him documents that revealed the most stunning aspect of his grandfather's plan. By selling the consolidated property to Mason for $1, Silas had triggered multiple legal mechanisms that his opponents hadn't anticipated. The sale invalidated several fraudulent claims, activated dormant water rights, and most importantly, established Mason as what the legal documents called a purchaser in good faith without notice, someone whose rights couldn't be challenged by prior fraud. Every piece of land they stole, every forged document they filed, every fake corporation they created, your ownership of this property makes all of it legally challengeable. Joe's voice carried deep satisfaction. Your grandfather spent 15 years building a legal nuclear bomb, and he handed you the detonator. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. In the bottom of the last container, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax, Mason found a document that changed everything he thought he knew about the situation. It was a federal lawsuit, already prepared and notarized, naming the Milbrook Development Corporation and its principals as defendants in a massive fraud case. The lawsuit detailed decades of illegal activity and included evidence that could send several prominent community members to federal prison. Holy shit, Mason whispered, reading through the charges. Silas was going to take them all down. He was, but he died before he could file it. The lawsuit required specific property ownership conditions to be met, conditions that could only be triggered by the sale to you. Joe pointed to a clause near the end of the document. You see this section? By accepting ownership of the consolidated property, you become the legal representative of everyone they defrauded. You can file this lawsuit on behalf of 30 families who lost their land. Mason sat heavily on a wooden crate, the magnitude of his inheritance finally becoming clear. He hadn't just bought a cabin and some land. He'd inherited a war that had been 15 years in the making, complete with weapons his grandfather had forged specifically for the battle ahead. Why didn't he tell me? Why let me stumble into this blind? Joe's expression grew gentle. Because if you'd known what you were walking into, would you have come? Mason thought about his life on the road, the temporary jobs, the constant movement from place to place. If someone had told him he was inheriting a legal war against half the county power structure, he probably would have kept driving. Besides, Joe continued, Silas needed you to discover the truth the same way he did, piece by piece, getting angry enough to fight back. He knew that if you were going to take on this kind of opposition, it had to be your choice, not his. Buck had been exploring the cellar during their conversation, his nose working overtime on the various scents stored in the space. Now he returned to Mason's side, sensing the emotional weight of the revelations. There's one more thing, Joe said, pulling out a sealed envelope marked, "For Mason, open after you decide to fight." Inside was a letter in his grandfather's handwriting. If you're reading this, you've discovered what they tried to steal from our family and dozens of others. By now you've probably been threatened, intimidated, and pressured to give up what's rightfully yours. I'm hoping you've decided to fight back, because that federal lawsuit represents the only chance most of these families will ever have to get their land back. I won't lie to you, grandson. This fight will be dangerous. These people have money, connections, and they've already proven they're willing to use violence when other methods fail. But they've also made a critical mistake. They've tried to steal from a clay, and we've never been good at backing down from a fight. The choice is yours. You can sell the property, take the money, and walk away clean. No one would blame you. Or you can file that lawsuit and help me finish what I started 15 years ago. Either way, know that I'm proud of the man you became, even if I was too stubborn to tell you that when I had the chance. Your grandfather, Silas Elderwood. Mason folded the letter and sat in the silence of the underground chamber, surrounded by 15 years of meticulous planning and evidence gathering. Outside, the evening shadows were lengthening, and Buck was getting restless to return to familiar territory. But Mason's mind was racing through implications and possibilities. The federal lawsuit would destroy the development corporation and probably result in criminal charges for its principals. It would also make him the most hated man in the county and paint a target on his back that would last for years. On the other hand, 30 families had been cheated out of their land, and this might be their only chance for justice. Joe, Mason said finally, if I file this lawsuit, how long before they know about it? Federal court filings are public record. They'll know within hours? And how long before they try to kill me? Joe Crowfeather's expression was grim but unsurprised. Probably about the same amount of time. Mason looked at Buck, who was watching him with the patient attention that meant he was ready for whatever decision his human made. Then Mason looked at the lawsuit that could change everything. The smart play was to walk away. The right play was something else entirely. Mason spent that night in the hidden cellar, reading through every document his grandfather had compiled. By dawn, he understood the full scope of what Silas had uncovered. A conspiracy that went beyond simple land theft to include manipulation of county records, bribery of local officials, and the systematic destruction of legal documents that might have exposed the fraud earlier. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented. Bank records showing payments from shell corporations to county employees. Photographs of forged signatures on property transfers. Even audio recordings of conversations in which Harold Pittman discussed removing obstacles to land acquisition as the sun rose over the eastern ridge. Mason made his decision. Joe, he said, finding the old man preparing breakfast on a camp stove. I need you to help me get word to the families who lost their land. They should know what's coming. Joe Crowfeather studied Mason's face and nodded slowly. You're going to file it? I'm going to file it. But first, I need to make sure everyone understands what that means. This won't be quiet. Once that lawsuit hits federal court, there's going to be a war. Some wars are worth fighting. This one is. But I won't drag people into it without their consent. They spent the morning contacting the scattered victims of the Development Corporation's fraud. Some families had moved away after losing their land. Others had stayed in the area, working as hired hands on property that had once been theirs. All of them deserved to know that someone was finally prepared to fight back. The responses varied. Some people were eager for justice, regardless of the risks. Others had made peace with their losses and didn't want to reopen old wounds. A few were frankly terrified of the consequences of challenging powerful local interests. But by noon, Mason had received permission from 22 families to include their cases in the federal lawsuit. More than enough to make the case devastating to the defendants. At 2 o'clock, Mason called Sarah Chen from his satellite phone. "Sarah, I need you to file a federal lawsuit today. I'm sending you documentation by encrypted email. Mr. Clay, federal litigation is expensive and complex. Are you sure you want to?" "I'm sure. And Sarah, once you file this, both of us are going to be targets. Make sure your security is tight." The next few hours were a blur of activity. Mason uploaded his grandfather's evidence to secure servers, made copies of critical documents, and established communication protocols with Joe Crow Feather and Jennifer Walsh. If something happened to him, the fight would continue. Buck seemed to sense the changed atmosphere, staying close to Mason throughout the preparations. The dog's protective instincts were fully engaged now, his eyes constantly scanning the perimeter for threats. At 4:30, Sarah Chen called back. "It's filed. Mason, this is going to explode like a bomb in that community. The evidence you provided is solid enough to justify criminal referrals to the FBI. We're talking about federal fraud charges, conspiracy, racketeering. This could put people in prison for decades. How long before they know? Court filings are immediately available online. If they're monitoring federal court records, and they probably are, they know already." Mason ended the call and walked onto his porch, looking out over the land that had become the center of a war 15 years in the making. The evening shadows were long, and the air carried the scent of approaching weather. Buck sat beside him, alert and ready. They didn't have long to wait. The first sign of trouble came from Mason's trail cameras, which sent alerts to his phone as multiple vehicles approached the property from different directions. Mason counted at least 8 separate heat signatures moving through the timber, all converging on the cabin. He'd expected this. The filing of the federal lawsuit had forced his opponents into a corner, and cornered men with everything to lose were dangerous. But Mason had advantages they didn't know about: detailed knowledge of the terrain, defensive positions his grandfather had prepared, and most importantly, the moral certainty that comes from fighting for what's right. Joe Crow Feather appeared from the tree line, moving with the silent efficiency of someone who'd learned woodcraft from childhood. "They're coming," he reported. 3 vehicles on the main road, at least 2 more following the old logging trails. Armed and moving fast, Mason had already moved his critical documents to the hidden cellar and prepared the cabin for siege. Solar panels provided power. The well gave him unlimited water, and his grandfather's gun safe contained enough firepower to hold off a small army. "Joe, you need to get out of here. This isn't your fight." The old man's eyes flashed with something that might have been amusement. "Boy, I've been fighting these thieves longer than you've been alive. Besides, your grandfather asked me to look after you if things went bad." "When did he ask that?" "About 15 years ago, when he first figured out they'd probably try to kill whoever inherited this mess." Joe pulled a rifle from where he'd hidden it in the woodshed. Silas was thorough about planning for contingencies. As darkness fell, Mason's property transformed into a battlefield. Motion sensors activated floodlights, revealing figures in tactical gear moving through the timber. The attackers had come prepared for violence, but they'd underestimated their opponent's preparation. Mason's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Last chance. Walk away now and nobody gets hurt," he replied. "Come and take it." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions, shattering windows and punching holes in the cabin's log walls. Mason and Joe took cover behind interior walls, reinforced with steel plating, another of Silas's preparations, but the attack was poorly coordinated, more intimidation than tactical assault. The shooters were ranchers and businessmen, not soldiers, and their lack of military experience showed in their positioning and communication. Mason's counterattack was precise and devastating. Using the cabin's elevated position and prepared firing ports, he and Joe methodically eliminated the attackers' cover and forced them to retreat to less advantageous positions. The siege continued through the night, with periodic exchanges of gunfire interrupted by attempts at negotiation. Harold Pittman's voice carried across the darkness, offering increasingly desperate deals, money, property in other states, anything to get Mason to drop the lawsuit. But Mason had passed the point of negotiation. His grandfather's evidence was already in federal hands. Backup copies were secured in multiple locations, and the legal process was beyond stopping. As dawn approached, the nature of the conflict changed. Instead of random gunfire, Mason heard the organized movement of people withdrawing. Car engines started in the distance, and the constant pressure of surveillance lifted. Joe peered carefully through a shattered window. "They're pulling back. Why?" The answer came from Mason's satellite phone. Sarah Chen calling with news that changed everything. "Mason, federal marshals raided Harold Pittman's office 2 hours ago. They've arrested him, Tom Brennan, and 3 county officials. The FBI is treating this as an organized crime investigation now. The legal nuclear weapon Silas had built was detonating exactly as planned. The evidence Mason had provided wasn't just supporting a civil lawsuit. It was enabling federal criminal prosecutions that would destroy the conspiracy completely." Through the morning hours, Mason watched from his porch as law enforcement vehicles filled the valley. FBI agents, federal marshals, state police, and even some honest local deputies were executing search warrants and making arrests throughout the county. Jennifer Walsh called around noon with an update. "It's over. Mr. Clay, the Development Corporation has been shut down, their assets frozen, and the criminal investigation is expanding. They're finding evidence of fraud in 3 other counties, but for Mason, sitting on his porch with Buck beside him and Joe Crowfeather working on repairs to the cabin, the real victory was quieter and more personal. He'd found something he'd never expected to find, a place worth defending, a cause worth fighting for, and the deep satisfaction that comes from standing up to bullies and winning. The road ahead would be complex. The federal lawsuit would take years to resolve completely, and rebuilding trust in the community would be a long process. Some of the families who'd lost their land might never get it back, and some of the damage done to the county's reputation might never fully heal. But the conspiracy was broken. The thieves were under arrest, and the systematic theft of family land was finally ended. As Mason looked out over the property that had cost him so much to keep, he realized that his grandfather had given him something more valuable than land or mineral rights. Silas had given him the chance to discover who he really was when everything was on the line. And that, Mason thought as Buck stretched out in the afternoon sun, was worth fighting for. The silence that followed the arrests was profound in a way that Mason hadn't experienced since his first morning on the ranch. For weeks, his property had been the center of conflict, tension, and violence. Now, with federal agents processing evidence and the conspiracy's leaders in custody, an almost supernatural quiet had settled over the land. Mason stood in his bullet-scarred cabin, surveying damage that told the story of the night's battle. Shattered windows, splintered wood, and bullet holes in the walls would need repair, but the structure itself remained sound. His grandfather had built well and prepared even better. Joe Crowfeather was examining one of the steel plates that had stopped several rifle rounds, his weathered fingers tracing the impact marks. "Silas really thought of everything, didn't he? Everything except making sure I knew what I was walking into. Maybe that was the smartest thing of all." Joe looked up from his examination. If you'd known, you might have been too careful. Might have tried to negotiate instead of fight. Through the broken windows, Mason could see FBI vehicles still moving along the valley roads. Agents methodically documenting crime scenes and collecting evidence. The investigation would continue for months, but the immediate threat was over. His phone rang. Sarah Chen with the legal update he'd been waiting for. Mason, I've just finished talking to the federal prosecutor. Based on the evidence you provided and what they've discovered in the raids, they're confident they can secure convictions on all the major charges. More importantly, they're prepared to support full property restoration for the fraud victims. Mason felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized had been tight. All of them. All of them. The families who lost land, the mineral rights that were stolen, the water rights that were illegally transferred. Everything can be reversed through the criminal restitution process. After the call, Mason walked to the edge of his property and looked out over land that stretched much further than he'd originally believed possible. Nearly 200 acres of Montana hill country, complete with mineral rights worth millions, water rights that controlled grazing for thousands of additional acres, and timber that could provide income for decades. But more than the financial value, the land represented something else, proof that one person could still make a difference, that standing up to corruption and theft could still matter, that sometimes the good guys really did win. Buck appeared at his side, the dog's coat still bearing traces of the morning's excitement, but his demeanor now relaxed and content. Together, they walked toward Willow Creek, where the sound of running water provided a peaceful counterpoint to the chaos of recent days. At the creek, Mason found Jennifer Walsh waiting for him, her expression carrying a mixture of relief and exhaustion that probably matched his own. "Thought you should know," she said. They found evidence that the corruption went beyond just land theft. County contracts, mineral leases, even some federal programs. The Development Corporation was skimming from everything they could access. How much? Preliminary estimates suggest over $20 million in fraudulent profits over 15 years. She sat on a fallen log beside the water. "Mason, your grandfather's lawsuit didn't just save your land. It exposed the biggest corruption case in Montana state history. The magnitude of it was still sinking in. What had started as an aging cowboy buying a cabin for $1 had become a federal case that would reshape the entire county's power structure. What happens now?" Jennifer smiled for the first time since Mason had known her. "Now you get to be boring. Own your land, run your cattle if you want to. Maybe develop some of those mineral deposits legally. Live the quiet life you came here looking for." The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent most of his adult life avoiding roots, responsibilities, and the kind of conflicts that came with caring too much about a place. Now he owned more land than he could explore in a lifetime, and had just fought a war to keep it. But as he sat by the creek, listening to water flow over stones, Mason realized that the conflict had changed him in ways he was still discovering. The man who'd driven into Milbrook, looking for a quiet place to hide, was gone. In his place was someone who understood that some things were worth fighting for, that home wasn't just a place but a choice, and that sometimes running toward trouble instead of away from it was the only path to peace. Buck splashed into the creek, his joyful play a reminder that life's simple pleasures remained unchanged regardless of legal complications or federal investigations. Mason watched his companion chase minnows in the shallows and felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, the deep contentment of being exactly where he belonged. The sun was setting behind the western ridge, painting the sky in shades of gold and red that reflected off the creek's surface. In a few hours, the stars would come out with the clarity that only existed far from city lights. The silence would deepen, broken only by the sounds of night hunters and the whisper of wind through sage. For the first time since inheriting his grandfather's legacy, Mason could imagine spending the rest of his life in this place, tending this land, maybe even building something worth passing on to future generations. The thought surprised him with its appeal. Mason Clay, who had never stayed anywhere long enough to call it home, was suddenly imagining decades of belonging to these hills and creeks. 3 days later, Mason found himself in Milbrook's community center, facing a room filled with families who'd been victims of the Development Corporation's fraud. The meeting had been organized by Jennifer Walsh and Joe Crow Feather, but Mason knew that as the man who'd triggered the federal investigation, he needed to face the people whose lives had been disrupted by his decision to fight. The crowd was diverse: elderly couples who'd lost ranches that had been in their families for generations, middle-aged farmers who'd been forced to sell under pressure, young families who'd watched their inheritance disappear into legal quicksand. Some faces showed gratitude, others held suspicion, and a few reflected the wariness of people who'd been disappointed by promises before. Carol Hartwell sat in the front row, her expression unreadable. She'd been cleared of any involvement in the fraud. Her role had been limited to processing paperwork provided by Harold Pittman. But Mason could see the weight of guilt in her shoulders. As a lifelong resident of Milbrook, she'd been as much a victim as anyone else. Mason had prepared remarks, but looking at the faces before him, he set his notes aside and spoke from the heart. "I know some of you are wondering why I didn't just take the money and walk away. Truth is, I thought about it. Would have been easier for everyone, especially me." A few people nodded. They understood the appeal of avoiding conflict, but my grandfather left me more than land. He left me evidence of what was stolen from all of you, and he left me the legal tools to get it back. Walking away would have meant letting the people who robbed your families keep what they stole. An elderly man in the third row stood up. Mason recognized him from the photos in his grandfather's files, Robert Martinez, whose family had lost 400 acres to a fraudulent mineral rights claim in 2003. "What happens to us now?" Martinez asked. "Some of us lost our land 20 years ago. We've built different lives, found other work. How do we get back something we learned to live without?" It was the central question, and Mason had been thinking about it since the arrests. The federal prosecutor had promised restitution, but legal victories and practical restoration were different things. "Mr. Martinez, according to the evidence, your family's land is currently being used as grazing lease by 3 different ranches. The criminal restitution process will restore your ownership, but you'll have decisions to make about what to do with it." Mason looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. "That's true for all of you. Getting your land back is just the first step. Some of you might want to ranch again. Others might want to sell, this time at fair market value, to buyers of your choosing. Some might want to lease grazing or mineral rights to generate income without active management." A woman near the back raised her hand. "What about you? You've got more land than most counties. What are your plans?" Mason had been asked this question by reporters, federal agents, and his lawyer. But somehow it felt different, coming from someone whose family had suffered losses similar to his grandfather's. "I'm going to live on it, work it. Maybe develop some of the mineral deposits responsibly. Maybe lease some grazing rights to local ranchers who operate honestly." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I'm also going to make sure that what happened to your families never happens to anyone else around here." After the meeting, Mason found himself walking Milbrook's main street for the first time since the crisis began. The town felt different now. Some people nodded respectfully, others avoided eye contact, and a few offered genuine smiles of gratitude. The community was adjusting to a new reality in which corruption had been exposed and power structures had shifted. At Morrison's general store, the teenage clerk who'd previously ignored him now treated him with the respectful wariness reserved for local celebrities. Mrs. Morrison emerged from behind the meat counter to speak with him. "Personally, Mr. Clay, I wanted to thank you. My brother lost his ranch to those thieves in 2007, thought he'd never see it again. The federal prosecutor says full restitution is likely for all the victims. It's not just about the land." Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "It's about justice, about someone finally standing up and saying that stealing from hard-working families isn't acceptable. On the drive back to his ranch, Mason reflected on the changes that 3 weeks had brought to his life. He'd arrived in Milbrook as a drifter with a bad knee and a loyal dog, looking for a quiet place to disappear. Now he was a landowner, a federal witness, and apparently a local hero to some people. The transition from invisibility to prominence felt surreal. But it also felt right in ways he was still discovering. Back at the cabin, Joe Crowfeather was waiting on the porch with a pot of coffee and a satisfied expression. How did it go? Better than expected. People are scared and hopeful in equal measures, but they're starting to believe that things might actually change for the better. Joe poured coffee into 2 mugs and handed one to Mason. Your grandfather would be proud. He always said that fighting corruption was like treating cancer. You have to cut out all of it, or it comes back stronger. Buck emerged from his afternoon nap and padded over to accept attention from both men. The dog's relaxed demeanor reflected the changed atmosphere on the property. No more tension, no more constant vigilance, no more sense of imminent threat. Mason looked out over his land, noting how the afternoon light transformed the sage and pine into a landscape that seemed to glow from within. In a few weeks, he'd need to make practical decisions about the property's future. Mineral development, grazing leases, timber management, water rights allocation, all the complex business of turning inherited land into sustainable income. But tonight, he was content to sit on his grandfather's porch with his grandfather's friend and his faithful dog, watching the sun set over land that was finally, legally and permanently his. Joe, Mason said, I'm thinking about asking you to stay on as a partner. This place is too big for one man to manage, and you know more about it than anyone else alive. Joe Crowfeather's weathered face crinkled into a smile. Been waiting 40 years for someone to make that offer. Silas talked about it but never got around to asking. I'm asking. Then I'm staying. As darkness settled over the ranch, Mason felt the deep satisfaction that comes from making decisions that honor the past while building toward the future. His grandfather's long war against corruption was finally over, but the work of building something better was just beginning. 6 months later, Mason Clay stood on the same porch where his grandfather had once planned a war against corruption, watching the sun rise over land that stretched further than his eyes could follow. The bullet holes in the cabin walls had been repaired, the shattered windows replaced, and the scars of battle had faded into memory. But the changes that mattered most weren't visible from the outside. Buck padded across the porch with the measured gait of a dog whose territory was secure and whose purpose was clear. At 9 years old, the border collie had found his forever home, and his contentment was evident in every relaxed movement. He settled beside Mason's chair with a satisfied sigh that seemed to express approval of how their lives had unfolded. The morning quiet was broken by the rumble of a diesel engine approaching on the improved road that now served the eastern section of Mason's property. Joe Crowfeather appeared around the bend, driving a truck loaded with fence posts and wire. Behind him followed Robert Martinez in his own pickup, ready for another day of rebuilding what had been stolen from his family. The federal criminal case had concluded 3 months earlier with guilty pleas from all major defendants. Harold Pittman would spend the next 15 years in federal prison. Tom Brennan had received 8 years for his role in the conspiracy. The corrupt county officials faced various sentences, and the shell corporations had been dissolved with their assets distributed to the fraud victims. More importantly, the restitution process had restored over 15,000 acres to their rightful owners. Some families, like the Martinez clan, had chosen to return to ranching. Others had sold their recovered land at fair market value, finally receiving the compensation they'd been cheated out of decades earlier. A few had decided to lease their property to Mason, creating a network of interconnected ranches managed cooperatively. The transformation of Milbrook itself had been equally dramatic. New county commissioners had been elected on platforms of transparency and honest government. The real estate market had stabilized as property ownership became clear and legally secure. Most surprisingly, the publicity surrounding the case had attracted new businesses and residents who wanted to be part of a community that had proven it could root out corruption. Carol Hartwell had been among the first to benefit from the new atmosphere. Her real estate business was thriving as honest property transactions replaced the shadowy dealings of the previous era. She'd stopped by the ranch the week before to update Mason on a large land purchase by a conservation group interested in protecting watershed areas. "Funny thing," she'd said, sitting on Mason's porch with coffee and the comfortable ease of renewed friendship. "People seem to trust real estate transactions more when they know the government isn't helping anyone steal land." Jennifer Walsh had been promoted to head the county assessor's office, replacing her supervisor, who'd been implicated in the document forgery scheme. Her first major initiative had been the complete digitization of property records, making it virtually impossible for future corruption to hide in bureaucratic complexity. Even the physical landscape showed signs of positive change. Mason's decision to develop his mineral rights responsibly had created jobs while maintaining environmental standards. The copper extraction operation employed 15 local residents and generated revenue that supported schools, roads, and public services. Water from the restored Willow Creek watershed now supported sustainable grazing on nearly 30,000 acres of previously marginal ranch land. As Mason watched Joe and Robert begin their morning work, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 12 months earlier, he'd been a drifter with no permanent address, no meaningful connections, and no particular purpose beyond finding the next temporary job. The man who'd bought a cabin for $1 had been running from responsibility, not toward it. Now he owned and managed more land than most corporations, employed dozens of local residents, and served on the county planning commission to ensure that development proceeded thoughtfully. He'd discovered that having roots didn't trap a person. It freed them to build something lasting. The phone call he'd been expecting came at mid-morning. Sarah Chen, his attorney, with news about the final civil lawsuit settlement. "Mason, I've just received confirmation on the last of the restitution payments. Every family that lost land to the Development Corporation fraud has now received full compensation, plus interest and damages. The total recovery exceeds $40 million. Mason set down his coffee, still amazed by the magnitude of what his grandfather's plan had accomplished. "Any appeals or remaining legal issues?" "None. The criminal convictions make the civil determinations final." "It's over, Mason. You've won about as completely as anyone can win a legal battle." After the call, Mason walked to the hidden cellar where his grandfather's evidence had been stored. Most of the documents were now in federal archives, but he'd kept copies of Silas's personal letters and planning notes. Reading them again, Mason was struck by his grandfather's patience and long-term thinking. 15 years of preparation for a battle that would be fought by someone else. With weapons forged for purposes the wielder wouldn't understand until the moment came to use them. One letter, which Mason had never shown to anyone else, revealed the depth of Silas's planning. "I know that asking someone to inherit a war is unfair. But I also know that some fights are worth having, and some legacies are worth the cost of defending them. If you're reading this, grandson, it means you chose to fight rather than run. That makes me prouder than I ever had the wisdom to tell you when I was alive." Buck appeared at the cellar entrance, his presence a gentle reminder that the present moment deserved attention as much as the past. Together, they walked back toward the cabin, where Joe Crowfeather was preparing lunch and planning the afternoon's work on the irrigation system that would expand the sustainable grazing to another 1,000 acres. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on Mason. He'd spent 30 years avoiding the kind of responsibilities that came with owning property and caring about communities. Now he found himself at the center of both and discovered that the burden was also a privilege. As evening settled over the ranch, Mason sat on his porch with Buck beside him and watched lights come on in the valley below. Some of those lights illuminated homes on land that had been restored to families who'd thought they'd lost it forever. Others marked new construction by people who'd come to Milbrook because they'd heard it was a place where justice was possible and corruption couldn't. The night sounds of his inherited land, wind through sage, the distant call of a hawk, the whisper of Willow Creek over stones had become the soundtrack of home. The silence that had once felt empty now felt full of possibility. Mason Clay had finally stopped running. In finding a place worth defending, he discovered that some roots run deeper than geography, connecting a person not just to land but to purpose, community, and the satisfaction that comes from building something better than what came before. Buck stretched and yawned, then settled more comfortably against Mason's leg. The dog's contentment was complete and uncomplicated, a reminder that the best victories were often the simplest ones: a safe place, meaningful work, and the company of those who matter most. In the distance, a coyote called to the stars, and Mason Clay, no longer a drifter, no longer running, no longer alone, called softly back.